we will now continue. We'll have now our first keynote presentation from Michale Heron from Chalmers Institute of Technology. It's like Chalmers University.
That'll do.
And Gothenburg University, so he's from a joint department. But the real reason that we wanted to bring Michale here is because he has been doing an amazing work with people like us and accessibility and board game accessibility reviews, and also research in terms of board games accessibility. But Michale will be a better person to explain you about it, so I will pass on the word to him. Thank you so much for being here, Michale.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me. So I'm not going to bore you too much with biographical details, because what I tend to say to people is I'm always the least interesting person in any room. But what I will do is I will talk a little bit about why, actually, before we get into it, this is basically the topic that I want to hit here. That game accessibility is something that matters, and it matters that it matters. Because this is a conversation I've had with a lot of people in a lot of different ways. The question of, given how much there is left to do in making the world in general accessible, why should we worry about making accessible games? So the main important points to sort of contextualize what I'm going to say here. Number one, I and my partner here, Pauline, have been working in the area of board game accessibility for a while now, about 7-ish, coming on 8 years. The website that Carol mentioned, Meeple Like Us, is a repository of not all the insights we've come up with, but a lot of the insights, looking at various different games from various kinds of categories of accessibility. And the thing is, this is an incredibly, unbelievably interesting area. I started my PhD looking at the accessibility of technology for an older workforce. And that was interesting in itself, because older adults are a really complex demographic group to design technology for. But when I started to get into board games, I had exactly the same thing that our panel spoke about. These aren't games, these are research material, shelves and shelves of research material. And the more I dug into this, my background being accessibility, the more I dug into the accessibility of board games, the more I found that this was probably the single most interesting intersection of accessibility and problem domain that exists, or at least that I've found. But the fact that I found that interesting hasn't stopped a lot of the objections that some people have had to this. Lots of real world problems. Why does it matter if games are accessible? And particularly, why does it matter about why board games are accessible? And that's the thing I'd like to talk about today, because I think this is important. I think the accessibility of culture is important. And I'd like to do a little bit to sort of hopefully bring those of you who might be a little bit hesitant on that idea, to bring you along and see why this is something that deserves attention. So first of all, let's talk about what we actually mean by accessibility, because accessibility has a lot of different definitions. You might, for example, if any of you are sort of video game players, you might be familiar with the standard debate over accessibility and difficulty settings. Dark Souls is an inaccessible game because it doesn't have difficulty levels. But that's not really the way in which we tend to talk about it within the usability or the human-computer interaction areas. We tend to talk about it in terms of barriers to people fully interacting with a product or a service, or even in some cases an idea. So this is a working definition that I'm going to use for the talk today. Inaccessibility is something that stands between someone and something they want to accomplish. Now, in a lot of cases, these are obvious physical or cognitive or emotional issues, but also the things that, for example, our panel were talking about, the representation of women in games, for example. Cardboard Republic, who are a board game review site, a few years ago did one of my favourite articles, which went through the Board Game Geek top 500, maybe top 100, and counted what the actual covers of the games were. And what they found out was you were far more likely to see a sheep on the cover of a board game than you were to see a woman. So imagine you go into a board game shop, you look at the shelves there, and you think, okay, so this is a hobby either for middle-aged white guys or livestock. It's not a hobby that is supposed to be designed for me. So some of these issues are really just in how we present ourselves or present this hobby to other people. And some of them are actual things that people can't work around. Sometimes they're social things. Sometimes they're economic things. Board games nowadays are ridiculously expensive. I went into a board game shop the other day and saw like the average price was something like €100 for the games I was looking at. And for a lot of people, €100 is not an amount of money that you can put down on a game. It's just not possible, particularly times like now where inflation and such is rising. So we have this wide range of possible things. But we also have issues that are intersectional, as in the combination of different factors has its own particular interest and complexity. For example, there's a lot of games that have, like living card games, for example, where you buy a box set and then you buy expansions and expansions and expansions. For a lot of those games, they sort of put things like inclusion and representation and all these things into later on expansions. They don't build them into the core game. And that's an intersection of a social issue and an economic issue. So within board games, all these things manifest in the most interesting and complex ways. And it's the reason why that this went from a research interest to something more akin to a research obsession. I spent a long time looking into this stuff, just because every time I looked into something new, there was something incredibly exciting. Before I got into the board game side, I was interested in the accessibility of video games, but really that's an easier problem. I'm not going to say it's a solved problem, but we have very clear solutions, and we know what direction things should be moving in. But the thing is, with a video game, we know how people interact with video games. They have a keyboard or a mouse. They have a controller. They have a monitor. They have maybe a VR headset. There's a relatively small number of potential ways people can interact with a video game. And that means if you want to make big improvements in how accessibility works in video games, you can address them to a relatively small number of things. PlayStation, for example, they've just released the design plans for their new accessible controller. And when they release that, every PlayStation game is going to become significantly more accessible. Xbox a while ago released their adaptive controller, and when they did that, the baseline of accessibility for Xbox games went way up. So by addressing these kind of common interface components, you can make these massive changes. Every board game, however, is completely different. Every board game invents its user interface anew. Even if they have exactly the same components, this game has dice, it has cards, it has a board. What you'll find is, regardless of that, they all use them in completely different ways. And every time they use them in a different way, it's less likely that a solution for one will work for another one. So I'm going to go through some quick examples here of what I mean by that. Top left-hand corner, we have Tiny Epic Galaxies, which has a lot of dice you roll. You roll those dice, and they enable particular actions that you take. So, a standard game of dice rolling, very small components, but we won't worry about that just yet. This here is Race for the Galaxy. It has a number of scoring chips that get picked up in the course of performing certain actions in the game. When those chips disappear, the game is over. We have down here Archaeology, which is a fantastic game of set collection, but it's basically just a game where you have a hand of cards and you trade things in and out of the centre. And then we have Catan, a game which, let's leave aside the fact is the only game I cannot play because I constantly feel the need to flip over the table. Let's leave that part aside. But it's a game that has a modular board with different values for how rich each of the hexes are going to be. But that board stays the way it is from the start of the game. Maybe you put houses and roads and things, but that board remains as it is. So, top left dice, top right scoring, Bottom left, cards. Bottom right, a modular board. Top left here, Lords of Vegas. And the thing about Lords of Vegas is you roll a lot of dice. But what happens with those dice is they get put into territory markers. And what they show is the strength of presence you have in an area. So a lot of the solutions that people have for rolling dice, electronic dice rollers, for example, or accessible dice like big dice or braille dice, don't work with this because those don't fit into these little collars. And those collars are important because they show what kind of things you own. Tigris and Euphrates also has scoring chips, but unlike the relatively straightforward way that Race for the Galaxy does it, when you run out of chips, that's one of the ways the games can end. Here you get scored based on the number of the lowest category that you have. So there's this really different way in which the chips work. You can have a massive pile of them, and at the end of it your score is 5, because you only had 5 of the red ones. Bottom left here we have a game called Innovation, and Innovation is also a game that has a deck of cards in it. But the thing about Innovation is the direction in which you fold those cards out. The terminology in the game is splay the cards. Makes a big difference. Splaying to the left, splaying up, spraying to the right. It reveals a different number of symbols on the collections of the cards. So this is its own new and interesting complex relationship. And then here we have Hive. And Hive, kind of like Catan, has this modular board setup. It's made up of hexes. But the way in which the board works changes based on the moves that people make. Essentially, the board in Hive is constantly crawling over the table, much like the theme would suggest. And just because you know a particular relationship of pieces, just looking at it at the start, doesn't mean that relationship of pieces is going to work later on. So again, dice, scoring chips, cards, and a modular board. So each of those is a game that makes use of a particular kind of component, but in a completely different way from the one that preceded it. So this idea of what is a board game interface is very, very difficult. That poses a massive accessibility challenge. Because the thing is, in games, it's not even just the case of if you can solve the inaccessibilities, the games will be better. There is a problem with this particular topic, and it is, inaccessibility is where fun comes from. There is no fun without inaccessibility. Now I'm going to make the ill-advised effort to explain a game of sport here, because I'm not a sports guy, believe it or not. Not a big sports person, but I am going to try and explain how golf works. Imagine a game of golf that is literally just you standing here, there's a hole there, and you nudge a ball into the hole from where you're standing. That's, I guess, technically a game, but it's not a very fun game. So what people do instead is they say, right, okay, you're not going to kick the ball in, you're going to use this stick. This stick is how you're going to get the ball in the hole. Hit the ball with the stick, goes in the hole, still not a hugely interesting game. So you take the hole and you put it hundreds and hundreds of yards away. And then you say, right, you're going to hit that ball there into that hole. That's now actually more fun because there's a challenge there. Then you put in bunkers, and then you put in trees, and then you put in traps and all these different kinds of things. And then suddenly you have the game of golf that people are actually obsessed with. Every single one of those things is an inaccessibility that got added in to make the game more fun. Without any of those inaccessibilities, golf is not a fun game. So when we talk about how do we make games more accessible, we're not really talking about how do we remove their inaccessibilities. What we're talking about is removing their unintentional inaccessibilities. The things that are inaccessible because they make the game what it is, they stay. Everything else we can maybe get rid of. Scrabble without words would not be Scrabble. So essentially, if you want to make Scrabble a more accessible game, you have to look at things that aren't the cognitive aspects of it. So we're going to go through some quick examples here of what I mean by that. This is Yamatai, which is a game from Days of Wonder, and it's a very striking game on the board. Top left here we have the view that most people can see. The other views are different categories of colour blindness, what you might see looking at the board. So we have here Deuteranopia, Tritanopia, and Protanopia. And what you can see is, if you have the one that's the top right or the one that's the bottom left, it's not easy to make out at all where these different things are. Yamatai needs this complexity of the game. That's just the nature of how it works. But it doesn't need this color scheme. It could have a different color scheme, or it could use different kinds of components to indicate different kinds of players. And then it would become easier for people with color blindness to make use of. The complexity of the board state, that has to be there. The color scheme, maybe not. This is Tashkalar. Tashkalar is a game that has enormous spatial complexity, which is to say the combination of things and where they are on the board is very important. It's not Tashkalar if you don't have this degree of complexity trying to match these arrangements of icons to the arrangements of icons in the card to trigger special powers. But there's no reason they all have to be circular. There's no reason that they couldn't be different shapes so that you can tell by touch where different things are. So, cognitively inaccessible, can't really get around that. But it could be easier for people who have low vision. It could be something that they could play with if the pieces were a bit more differentiated by touch. Terraforming Mars absolutely needs the multiple complexity of its economies. So you've got, for example, I can't remember what these things are. Let's just say gold, frankincense, and myrrh for the sake of argument. You have these different things here, and they represent different resources that you have on Mars. It needs that. It needs these markers that let you determine how fast and quickly things increase and decrease. What it doesn't need is this little pad here that is so frictionless that if you sneeze, you will basically randomize the game state. It needs the economy. It doesn't need this, I don't want to say low quality, but basically this minimal friction interface. That could be a lot more accessible just if it had this different thing. Spyfall is a game of trying to pretend you know where you are based on what other people are saying to you. And it's a really fun game, but certainly the first edition of it, I don't know if this is true for later editions, it came with this sheet of things, which were all the possible locations people could be. Thing is, if you were the spy, there was only one of those. So if you were actually wanting to at least have a fighting chance, you had to sort of very covertly, look over at the thing without anybody noticing. Because looking at this is basically the same thing as saying, I'm the spy. So it needs to have all these different locations. But maybe if I had a few more of those that people can everybody can put in front of them, maybe it's a more accessible game for that. Arkham Horror, the card game, is basically Magic the Gathering, but in the H.P. Lovecraft universe. And the thing is, it's a very, very complex game, full of all kinds of storytelling devices and all different kinds of rules and mechanics. And it needs all that. But what it doesn't need, I would say, is a business model that is indistinguishable from a mugging. You buy a box of this and it has 3/10 of the main story. And some of these kind of games work replaying the same thing over and over again because they let you build mastery of cards and mastery of how the systems work. But horror survives in the unexpected. And if you play through the same scenario again and again and again, you lose the horror aspect of that because it's no longer unexpected. So it needs all of its mechanical complexity, but the business system around it is, it's probably unfair to say it's hostile to users, but certainly that's the reason I returned it. So every game has features that have to be there that make the game inaccessible, but not all of those features have to be there if they aren't intentionally designed into the game. Cards Against Humanity, for example, it's difficult to have a game of Cards Against Humanity that doesn't have an emotional cost to people playing. I sometimes describe this as having splash damage, as in if people are playing Cards Against Humanity in a room, it doesn't matter if other people aren't playing. They're involved in what's going on. But it's hard to imagine a game of Cards Against Humanity that isn't so aggressively offensive that retains what Cards Against Humanity is supposed to be. Although I'm told they've actually released some censored versions, which I don't understand what they're doing, but apparently they have. Five Tribes. The inaccessibility here is just largely in terms of the complexity of the game state. to the point that you can't really, I don't think you can play Five Tribes well. I think you can play Five Tribes reactively. I think you basically react to things rather than plan for things. And Escape, the Curse from the Temple, is a game that sort of makes itself inaccessible because this by itself is fine. But Escape, the Curse of the Temple, is a game of rolling dice to try and unlock particular things that happen in the map. But you roll them as fast as you can at the same time as everybody else. So you can't have Escape, the Curse of the Temple without being real time. That's the cost of the game. You can't have this without the complexity of the environment. And you can't have this without some kind of emotional impact. Most games, though, are not designed purely around their inaccessibilities. The inaccessibilities come by accident. And what this work that we've been doing for the past 7 or so years has been aimed at doing is trying to work out what are the unintentional inaccessibilities and how do we get rid of them. And as I say, the core argument about this is we do that because games matter. And this is where we sort of bring this back to full circle to what I wanted to talk about to begin with. Games matter because culture matters. Culture matters because people matter. And one of the big important things that lets us connect together as people is the ability to share in a kind of collective appreciation of culture. There are, in video games, a whole pile of games that are designed specifically to be accessible games. So for example, there's a whole bunch of people who make what are called audio games, and those games are designed primarily for the deaf. The problem is, people who aren't deaf probably aren't playing those games. So if you want to have a conversation about games with your friends, saying, I played this amazing audio game, is not going to let you into the same culture as everybody else is. This raising the floor on accessibility is important because we're not looking to have accessible games. We're looking for games to be accessible. When we talk about games as elements of culture, no, go away, go. When we talk about games as elements of culture, we're not really talking about things that are passively consumed. Games are active. There's an active participation that comes along with playing games that isn't true in a lot of different kinds of culture. So this act of engaging with important elements of culture makes a difference because we are active contributors to how culture is appreciated. We don't just watch Game of Thrones. We have our theories about what happens. We have our theories about what happened at the end of the TV show, unfortunate as it may have been, versus what the end of the books is going to be. We have these arguments and discussions, and we make connections with people because of them. When we play the latest, Grand Theft Auto, let's say, when it comes out, that is going to be a cultural event that almost everybody will be touched by in some way, shape, or form. If you remember the advertising around Grand Theft Auto 5, it was on buses, it was on bus shelters, it was on billboards. Everybody, regardless if you were a gamer or not, everybody knew who the main characters in Grand Theft Auto were. It was a cultural event. So we are part of this collaborative construction of culture. We are always participants in creating the awareness and the understanding of what culture is actually about. When we have inaccessibility in games, what we're basically doing is robbing people of their ability to participate in the same culture as the rest of us. What we're basically doing is segregating people off into a kind of culture that is, to be honest, a lot more boring. One of the most interesting things that happens when you involve people with interesting and diverse personalities and physical traits and such is things get more interesting. You get broader perspectives. You get people who identify things that you would never have considered, perspectives you would never have considered. And the more homogenous our culture is, the more that it's designed around largely abled people, the more boring it becomes. But you've probably also seen, this is like, for example, talking about video games, but you've probably also seen that tabletop games are now starting to reach that point of cultural importance that 5 years ago would have been laughable. Whenever you talk about board games, I'm sure you've all had this experience. You tell people, I play board games, and what they say is, Monopoly? Don't you grow up with that like when you're 8 years old? And you say, no, board games are amazing now. And they say, okay. Because this is what people think when they hear board games. They think Monopoly, they think Cluedo, they think Risk. They don't think, for example, Terraforming Mars or Terra Mystica or anything. But Wingspan came out a few years ago, and we have a friend of ours who I would describe as a grudging game player. He will play games if you make him. But for the very first time, he said to me, I read about this board game in Nature. Do you have it? And we played this game. And, okay, it was a little bit more complicated than he was expecting. But the simple fact that he was able to apply his own knowledge to the game made it a much better experience for him. He was telling me what cards I had in my hand on the basis of what the diet was and where they were nesting. It was a really interesting experience. If you go into any bookshop these days, the chances are you're going to find Dungeons and Dragons in there. So this is something that has left the nerd sphere and has actually become something that is a part of mainline everyday culture. Right, I don't really have time for that, so I'm going to skip past here. One of the other things that's important about this, and this is sort of my final summing up point because I'm aware we're running short on time and I'd like to leave at least a few minutes for questions. This matters not just to people who have disabilities, or it doesn't matter to people who have impairments of any kind. This is something that affects all of us. Not necessarily right now, although often that is the case. But we all benefit from accessibility because in the future, we are all going to be older. Hopefully that's not news to anybody. That's something we're all aware of. Everybody loses some of their faculties as they get older. You become a little bit slower, your mind changes. You become a little bit more colorblind as you get older. My PhD supervisor had this thing that he said that basically shaped my view of this topic. And it's extraordinary people, as in people with disabilities, in ordinary circumstances, day-to-day life, have many of the same needs as ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. So for example, somebody who has Parkinson's trying to write a text message, the thing that helps them do that is the same thing that helps you write a text message when you're on a rickety bus. You know, the same solutions apply in all different kinds of circumstances. If you have any interest in this topic and you're willing to sort of engage in this topic, what you're basically doing is making things for the future version of you easier. Because I'm sure when we're all retired, assuming that actually happens, but if we all get to retire, we'll all want to play these games that we've been putting off because we've got work to do in the meantime. These shelves of games where we think, when the bombs fall, I'm going to play these games finally. And the only way that's actually going to happen is if now we start arguing and basically trying to pester people into making their games more accessible. Because if it doesn't happen now, when does it happen? And the chances are it happens too late for us to get any benefit out of it. So thank you for listening. I think we have 3 minutes or something for questions. But feel free to sort of hit me up at any point if you see me around. I'm quite happy to answer questions as we go on. So, any questions? Yeah?
Do you think there are genres of games that are more accessible than others?
Yeah, definitely. Games that, for example, like Cards Against Humanity is actually an incredibly accessible game because all you really need to be able to do is sort of see a card, or at least have a card and somehow communicated to you, and then match it to something that's narrated. Fun Employed, which is a similar kind of game, basically you randomly deal out a CV, and then you try and use that to apply for an imaginary job. And one of the coolest sub-modes in that is just randomly deal out a CV to somebody and make them respond to it. So you are, you're drunk, but you own a gun, and you are able to fly a plane. And you have to sort of incorporate these into the interview that you're having with somebody else. And because that doesn't require you to have any information that anybody else doesn't have, then it makes it so much easier for people who have any kind of disability to play. Generally speaking, collaborative games tend to be quite good. People often talk about things like quarterbacking and Pandemic being a design problem, but it's actually a massive accessibility aid as well, if somebody knows your game state and can help advise you on what's supposed to be happening. In terms of games that are less accessible, the category of gaming that I have found that has no obvious game that I can recommend to a person with a disability and a good game is physical games and, dexterity games and physical accessibility issues. Like, for example, Ice Cool or Crokinole or Pool or any of those games. I have never found, in the entire time of doing this work, a game that is accessible for that particular group of people, which is why one of the research projects I'm doing just now is trying to invent a technical system that helps support that. But yeah, they're basically for every category of game, for every category of inaccessibility, there is a game that fits that niche, but finding that game has always been the difficult problem as part of this work.
I have a question.
Yes?
We have 5 seconds.
I'll do my best to answer.
Because games provide deliberative and accessibility, do you think this is a good way we can use them as serious games to make people that don't have problems see the perspective of those that have some issues?
I mean, I definitely think you can do that with certain kinds of games, but it's very difficult to give. Right, let me roll that back a little bit. There's this philosophy in accessibility research which is called simulationism, which is the idea that you can simulate disability and to the point that you get useful insights for things. Like put somebody in a blindfold, you get the same information as somebody who's blind. And it's not actually true. In fact, it's not even a little bit true, because we can't lose the thread of knowledge that we had before this thing happened. So if games are designed for particular kinds of inaccessibility, I think they can be incredibly powerful tools for raising awareness. Nyctophobia, for example, is a game that was explicitly designed for the designer's blind uncle. And it's non-stigmatizing, it's never designed around this idea that it's an accessible game. But everybody at some point puts on a blindfold and has to sort of find people on the board. And I think that does give an appreciation of what that sense actually gives you in a game that otherwise wouldn't be perceivable in other kinds of games. But there are very, very few of them, I think, that are designed with that kind of thing in mind. And sometimes it's just, all it sort of raises is this pushback you get in places like Reddit and such, where people say, well, you know, not every game, you wouldn't expect somebody with no limbs to be able to wrestle. Why would you expect somebody who's blind to be able to play a board game? There is this sort of pushback on it. And the more sort of people talk about this kind of thing within the frame of games in general, I think the more resistance there is to it. I don't know if that's an answer to your question at all, but it's an answer to a question. Right, I think that's probably me for time, I would think.
I stopped the time.
Okay. Oh, right, well, I'll go back to an earlier slide then.
Can I do one more?
The last one.
Yeah, time.
Do you think there is a disability that is harder to adapt than all the other ones?
Yeah. Actually, I've got two answers for that one. One is the simple fact of the way that board games are designed means that cognitive inaccessibility is the most challenging category, I think. Because every rule you add in is a cognitive complexity. And the kind of solutions that exist are through what sometimes in educational literature we call scaffolding, which is the idea that you have simpler versions of a thing that lead you to more complex versions of a thing. And you can have scaffolded versions of games that have like the simple rules and then the advanced rules and the expert rules. But anytime you want to get to, because you always know the designer has the expert game in mind as being the correct version. Every time people play the versions that are sort of simpler, it sort of feels like you're not getting the full authentic experience. The other area that I think is particularly difficult is the area of total blindness, because people often have this idea that blindness equals darkness, and that's not actually true. The vast majority of people who are legally blind have some degree of sight. But what I realized when doing this project was that when I had total blindness at the end of a spectrum of can see perfectly well and total blindness, that was the wrong way of doing it. This here is basically an entirely different category. The difference between being able to see something, anything at all, versus nothing is absolutely massive. And so many of the games I looked at, I said, this will work for people who have visual inaccessibility issues unless you can't see anything. So cognitive impairments and the condition of being totally blind are two very, very difficult categories to deal with. Yeah? Good.
Thank you.
Okay.
you.